Most people think manipulators are dangerous because they lie. They're not. They're dangerous because they can make you betray yourself while convincing you it was your own decision. And that's the part almost nobody sees until it's too late. Have you ever walked away from a conversation replaying it in your head for hours, wondering how someone made you feel guilty when they were the one who crossed the line? That wasn't confusion. That was psychological positioning. Because the most effective manipulators don't dominate with aggression. They dominate with calmness, with patience, with subtle pressure. They don't scream at you. They study you, quietly, carefully, like a chess player watching for one emotional weakness they can exploit. And once they find it, they stop arguing with your mind and start programming your reactions. That's why some people can leave you emotionally exhausted without ever raising their voice. They know exactly when to stay silent, exactly when to guilt trip you, exactly when to act wounded, exactly when to make you question your own memory. And the frightening part? Most of these tactics look like normal communication to the untrained eye. Machiavelli understood this centuries ago. He believed the people who control perception control people, not through force, but through emotional leverage, through timing, through understanding human weakness better than the average person understands themselves. This video is about exposing that system, not with motivational cliches, not with revenge fantasies, and definitely not with dramatic confrontations that only make manipulators adapt. I'm going to show you 6 psychological tactics manipulators use to quietly gain control over people's emotions, boundaries, and decision-making, and more importantly, how to mentally outsmart them before they ever get access to your mind. Because once you see the pattern, their power starts collapsing in real time. And trust me, after this video, you'll never hear certain phrases the same way again. Number 1, the invisible contract. This is where weak men get psychologically bought without even realizing the transaction happened. Because manipulation rarely starts with disrespect. It starts with generosity, a favor, a compliment, support during a low moment, someone showing up for you when life feels heavy. And that's exactly why it works. Most men never notice the trap because their ego translates attention into loyalty. They assume kindness equals purity. But manipulators understand something most people are too naive to admit. Nothing creates leverage faster than emotional debt. Watch carefully how this plays out in real life. A friend keeps covering for you. A woman keeps doing thoughtful things you never asked for. A family member keeps sacrificing for you. At first, it feels warm, safe, genuine. Then one day the invoice arrives. Not directly. Never directly. That would expose the game. Instead, it sounds like this. After everything I've done for you. That sentence has destroyed more boundaries than anger ever could. Because now the conversation is no longer about the request. It's about your identity, your morality, your loyalty as a man. Suddenly saying no feels evil. And that's the psychological ambush. You're not responding from strength anymore. You're responding from guilt. I knew a guy who let his business partner slowly take over his entire company this way. Started with small favors, helping with meetings, covering expenses, solving problems before being asked. Looked loyal. Then came the pressure, the guilt, the subtle reminders, the emotional accounting ledger. By the time my friend realized what was happening, he wasn't making decisions anymore. He was repaying psychological debt that was never real to begin with. That's the invisible contract. And manipulative people love generous men because generous men often confuse gratitude with obligation. Listen carefully to this part because it'll save you years of emotional exhaustion. You can appreciate someone without surrendering yourself to them. Those are 2 completely different things. A strong man says, "I appreciate what you did." A manipulated man says, "So I guess I owe you." See the difference? One comes from grounded respect. The other comes from fear of being perceived as selfish. And manipulators know exactly how to exploit that fear. The moment you enforce a boundary, they'll switch masks instantly. Now you're cold. Now you've changed. Now you're ungrateful. Funny how their kindness suddenly disappears the second they stop getting access to your compliance. That's when you discover the brutal truth. It was never generosity. It was bait. Real generosity does not punish boundaries. Healthy people don't weaponize favors 6 months later during conflict. They don't keep emotional receipts waiting for the perfect moment to cash them in. Manipulators do, because every favor was an investment disguised as affection. And some of you watching this already know exactly who I'm talking about. You felt that heaviness in your chest when someone says, "I was there for you," not because they cared, but because you know what comes next. The request, the pressure, the guilt, the silent expectation that your freedom now belongs to them. Machiavelli understood this centuries ago. The easiest chains to place on a man are the ones he willingly locks around his own neck. That's why guilt is such a powerful weapon. The victim becomes his own prison guard. So here's the rule. Never repay kindness with self-betrayal. You do not owe people access to your peace, your boundaries, your time, or your masculinity just because they once did something nice for you. A gift with conditions is not a gift. It's a psychological down payment. Number 2, moral hijacking. This is where manipulation stops being emotional and becomes psychological warfare. Because now they're no longer attacking your weaknesses. They're attacking your virtues, your loyalty, your patience, your empathy, your identity as a good man. And if you've ever stayed too long in a toxic relationship, tolerated disrespect from family, or kept forgiving someone who clearly enjoyed hurting you, there's a high chance this is exactly what happened to you. They learned your moral code, then used it like a weapon pressed against your throat. Watch how subtle this is. You believe in loyalty, so they say. Real friends don't abandon people. You believe in forgiveness. Everyone makes mistakes. You pride yourself on emotional control. So now you're overreacting, and suddenly the entire conversation shifts. You're no longer judging their behavior. You're defending your character. That's the trap. A manipulator never wants to discuss what they did. They want to discuss whether your reaction makes you a bad person. That's why so many men stay trapped in cycles they should have walked away from years earlier. Not because they're weak, because they're morally blackmailed. I knew a guy who caught his girlfriend lying to him repeatedly. Screenshots, proof, the whole thing. But every time he confronted her, she never defended the lie itself. Instead, she'd go quiet and say, "I thought you were different. I thought you were emotionally mature." And it worked. Not because he believed her innocence, because he became addicted to proving he wasn't insecure. That's how deep this game goes. Some of you are not being controlled through fear. You're being controlled through the need to see yourself as noble. And manipulators know modern men are especially vulnerable to this because society trained you to associate boundaries with cruelty. So now every time you finally stand up for yourself, there's a voice in your head whispering, "Maybe I'm being too harsh. Maybe I should understand more. Maybe I'm the problem." No. You're finally seeing clearly. Listen carefully. Forgiveness does not require continued access. Compassion does not require self-destruction. And understanding someone's pain does not mean volunteering to become their emotional punching bag. That mindset right there changes everything. Because manipulators survive by confusing morality with submission. They want you to think being a good man means tolerating endless disrespect with a calm smile on your face. That's not masculinity. That's domesticated weakness disguised as virtue. A dangerous man understands something most people never will. Mercy without boundaries becomes self-annihilation. And this is why morally rigid men are often the easiest to manipulate. Machiavelli understood this centuries ago. Predictable morality creates predictable behavior. Once someone identifies the values you worship, they can steer you emotionally without you even noticing. Family, loyalty, peace, understanding, fairness, all beautiful values. All easily weaponized against men who lack psychological awareness. That's why you need to redefine your values on your terms, not theirs. When someone says, "I thought you believed in second chances," you respond, "I do. I just don't believe in unlimited chances without accountability." Cold, calm, final. No emotional courtroom. No over-explaining. No desperate attempt to prove you're still a good person. Because once you start defending your morality to manipulators, you've already lost positioning. Strong men don't argue for their boundaries. They enforce them. And here's the uncomfortable truth most people will never say out loud. Some people are only comfortable with your kindness when it comes with access to your weakness. The moment your kindness develops teeth, they call you toxic. Good. Let them. Because the version of you they miss is usually the version they could control. And the moment you realize that, their entire psychological hold starts collapsing. Number 3, emotional time control. This is one of the most invisible forms of manipulation because technically, nothing bad is happening. No screaming, no threats, no obvious abuse, just timing. But men who understand power know timing is everything. A manipulator does not attack you when you're sharp, calm, focused, and emotionally centered. They wait until your mind is overloaded, late at night, right before work, right after stress, right when you're exhausted enough to stop resisting. And if you think that's accidental, you still don't understand the game. Think about how many important arguments in your life started when you were mentally depleted. You're half asleep. You've just sat down after a brutal day. Your body is heavy. Your patience is low. You finally get 5 minutes of peace. Then suddenly, "We need to talk." Not tomorrow. Not when you can think clearly. Now. That's not emotional honesty. That's strategic timing. Because manipulators understand something most people never consciously realize. A tired man is easier to control than a weak man. Why? Because exhaustion lowers resistance. You stop analyzing. You stop challenging inconsistencies. You start negotiating just to make the pressure end. That's why so many men wake up the next morning replaying conversations in their head thinking, "Why did I agree to that? Why did I apologize? Why didn't I stand my ground?" Because you were psychologically cornered when your nervous system was running on fumes. I knew a guy whose girlfriend used to start serious emotional conversations at 1 a.m. almost every week. Never during the day. Never when he was relaxed. Always when he was exhausted and trapped in bed with nowhere to escape. And every single time, the outcome was the same. He'd apologize, over-explain, compromise, give in. Not because she was right, because he was tired enough to surrender. That's emotional time control. And once you see this pattern, you start noticing it everywhere. The family member who waits until holidays to create emotional pressure because they know you won't cause a scene. The friend who brings up important issues right before an event so your mind stays hijacked all night. The woman who suddenly needs emotional reassurance the second you focus on your mission, your work, your growth. None of this is random. It's behavioral timing designed to catch you emotionally off balance. And the cold truth is this. People reveal their true intentions through timing more than words. Healthy people want resolution. Manipulative people want advantage. Huge difference. That's why the moment you say, "We'll talk tomorrow," watch their reaction carefully. A healthy person says, "Fair enough." A manipulator panics. Suddenly you're avoiding. Suddenly you don't care. Suddenly you're running away from problems. No. You're refusing psychological ambushes. And this is where most men fail, because they've been conditioned to believe immediate emotional access equals maturity. It doesn't. Powerful men do not allow unrestricted access to their mental state. Read that again. You are not obligated to emotionally engage on command just because someone feels urgency. Most urgency is manufactured pressure designed to bypass your clarity. Machiavelli understood this perfectly. Whoever controls the timing controls the emotional terrain of the battle. That's why calm men are dangerous. They slow everything down. They do not react instantly. They do not negotiate under emotional pressure. They do not defend themselves while mentally exhausted. They choose the battlefield first. So the next time someone tries forcing an emotional conversation at the worst possible moment, stay calm and say, "I'll discuss this tomorrow." No anger. No explaining. No guilt. And if that simple boundary creates rage, pressure, or emotional escalation, you just exposed the real motive. Because people seeking understanding respect timing. People seeking control resent it. And once you stop operating on their emotional clock, their influence over you starts dying in real time. Number 4, weaponized confusion. This is where manipulation becomes dangerous on a completely different level. Because now they're no longer trying to control your behavior. They're trying to control your perception of reality itself. And once someone gains access to that, they can make you tolerate almost anything. You know that feeling after an argument where you walk away mentally exhausted, staring at the ceiling replaying every sentence over and over. Not because you were wrong, but because somehow they made you feel insane for noticing what happened. That's weaponized confusion. And the terrifying part is how subtle it looks from the outside. No violence. No obvious manipulation. Just small distortions. Tiny rewrites of reality. That never happened. You're remembering it wrong. You're too emotional. You always twist things. Listen carefully. The manipulator does not need to prove you wrong. They only need to make you uncertain enough to stop trusting yourself. That's the entire game. Because a man who doubts his own instincts becomes psychologically programmable. I knew a guy who used to keep screenshots of conversations because every disagreement with his girlfriend felt like entering another dimension. He'd confront her about something disrespectful she clearly said, and within 5 minutes he'd somehow be apologizing for his tone. Not the disrespect, not the lie, not the betrayal. His tone. That's how fast manipulators redirect the conversation. And if you're not careful, you won't even notice the switch happen. You'll walk into the conversation trying to solve a problem and leave questioning your own memory. That's not communication. That's psychological destabilization. And manipulative people are masters at blending truth with distortion. They'll admit to tiny harmless details just to make their larger lies feel believable. Okay, maybe I said that, but you're exaggerating. Yeah, I was upset, but that's not what I meant. Notice what's happening. They create just enough ambiguity to pull you into mental quicksand. Now you're analyzing wording, context, tone, timing. Meanwhile, the original issue quietly disappears. And the moment you start saying, "Maybe I misunderstood," they know they've got you. Because uncertainty weakens masculine clarity. A confused man cannot lead, cannot enforce boundaries, cannot trust his instincts. He becomes emotionally dependent on the manipulator to tell him what's real. That's the real goal. Not winning arguments. Owning your perception. Some of you watching this have already lived through it. You started recording conversations in your own head because reality around that person constantly felt unstable. One day they love you. Next day they deny things they clearly said. They provoke you quietly, then act shocked when you react. And eventually you stop trusting yourself altogether. You become softer, more hesitant, more apologetic. Not because you're weak, because your nervous system has been trained to second-guess itself. That's why gaslighting is so effective. It bypasses logic and attacks self-trust directly. Machiavelli understood something brutal about human psychology. Once a man doubts his own mind, he becomes easy to govern. That's why the strongest counterattack is not arguing harder. It's grounding yourself harder. Stop begging manipulators to validate your reality. They never will. Instead say, "That's how I experienced it." Cold, direct, unshaken. No debate. Because your experience does not require their permission to exist. And here's another truth nobody says out loud. Healthy people clarify confusion. Manipulative people manufacture it. Pay attention to patterns. If every serious conversation leaves you mentally foggy, emotionally drained, and strangely guilty for bringing up valid concerns, that is not miscommunication. That is psychological conditioning. Start documenting things. Not for them. For you. Because once the fog clears and you finally see the pattern clearly, something powerful happens. You stop asking for permission to trust your own instincts. And the moment a manipulator loses control over your perception, their entire system starts collapsing. Number 5, strategic emotional absence. This one is dangerous because it doesn't look like manipulation at first. There's no shouting, no threats, no dramatic confrontation. Just distance, coldness. A sudden emotional disappearance from someone who was warm 5 minutes ago. And if you've ever felt your stomach drop because someone you cared about suddenly became emotionally unreachable, then you already know how psychologically violent silence can be. Because silence forces the mind to fill in the blanks. That's why this tactic works so well. You set a boundary. You say no. You stop tolerating disrespect. And suddenly the energy changes. The texts get shorter. The affection disappears. Their voice changes. Their eyes feel colder. They're physically there, but emotionally they've vanished. And the message is clear without being spoken. This is what happens when you stop obeying. That's strategic emotional absence. Punishment disguised as distance. And manipulative people love this tactic because it gives them plausible deniability. If you call it out, they instantly flip the script. I'm just tired. I need space. You're overthinking. Now you look irrational for noticing the emotional shift they intentionally created. That's the genius of the tactic. They trigger your anxiety, then make you feel weak for reacting to it. I knew a guy who started losing himself trying to keep his relationship emotionally stable. Every time he stood up for himself, his girlfriend would emotionally disappear for days. No affection, no warmth, no emotional presence, just cold silence. And the worst part, she never openly admitted she was punishing him, which made him spiral even harder because now he couldn't even point to a specific problem. He just felt this constant pressure to fix the energy. So he started abandoning his own boundaries to restore connection. Read that again. He betrayed himself just to feel warmth again. That's how conditioning works. Eventually, your nervous system learns a brutal equation. Boundaries equal abandonment. And once that equation gets installed in a man's mind, manipulation becomes effortless. Because now they don't need to control you directly. Your fear of emotional withdrawal controls you for them. That's why some men become addicted to chasing approval from cold people. They're not chasing love anymore. They're chasing relief from emotional deprivation. Huge difference. And manipulative people understand something dark about human psychology. Intermittent warmth creates obsession. Hot, cold, attention, distance, validation, withdrawal. That inconsistency hooks the nervous system harder than stable affection ever could. It's the same psychological mechanism behind gambling addiction. Unpredictable rewards create emotional dependency. That's why some of you still think about people who treated you terribly. Your brain got trained to crave the return of warmth. Not the person, the warmth. Machiavelli understood this centuries ago. The person willing to withdraw emotionally without collapsing internally usually holds more power in the dynamic. And manipulators abuse this ruthlessly. But here's where strong men separate themselves emotionally from weak men. Weak men panic in silence. Strong men observe it. The moment someone withdraws emotionally to punish you, do not chase. Do not over-explain. Do not start performing emotional gymnastics trying to fix the atmosphere. That reaction is exactly what gives the tactic power. Instead, stay grounded, calm, steady, unmoved. Because when you stop rewarding emotional withdrawal with desperation, something fascinating happens. The manipulator loses psychological leverage. Either they return because the tactic stopped working, or they disappear completely. And if they disappear, good, because that means they were never attached to you. They were attached to controlling your emotional state. That's the truth most men refuse to accept. Some people do not love your presence. They love your emotional dependency. And the second you stop panicking when they go cold, their entire system of control starts collapsing in front of your eyes. Number 6, exit without exposure. This is the stage most men fail. Not because they can't see the manipulation anymore, but because their ego still wants justice. They want the final conversation, the confession, the apology. The moment the manipulator finally admits, "You were right," but listen carefully. That moment almost never comes, because manipulators do not process confrontation the way healthy people do. When you expose them, they don't reflect. They reposition. They deny, deflect, distort, reverse victim and offender. And before you realize what happened, you're no longer discussing their behavior. You're defending your reaction to their behavior. That's why the most dangerous mistake a man can make is trying to win closure from someone committed to misunderstanding him. I knew a guy who spent 3 years trying to communicate better with a manipulative woman. Every confrontation became a courtroom. He'd arrive calm, organized, logical. Screenshots, examples, specific moments. Didn't matter. 5 minutes later, she was crying about his tone, talking about how unsafe she felt, questioning his emotional stability. And by the end of the conversation, he'd be apologizing for hurting the feelings of the person who betrayed him. That's the trap. Manipulators feed on emotional engagement, especially male emotional engagement. Because the moment you become reactive, angry, desperate to be understood, you become easy to frame. And society will almost always remember your explosion before they remember what caused it. That's why intelligent men leave differently. Quietly, strategically, without emotional theater. Exit without exposure means understanding that protecting your peace is more important than proving your innocence. That sentence alone will save some of you years of suffering. Because the need to set the record straight is exactly what manipulators exploit. They bait you into long emotional conversations because every explanation gives them more material to twist. Every emotional reaction becomes evidence against you. So stop giving speeches. Stop trying to deliver cinematic final monologues, hoping they'll suddenly gain self-awareness. They won't. Some people understand exactly what they're doing. And that's the part most men struggle to accept. So what do you do instead? You reduce access. Emotionally first. Then psychologically. Then physically if necessary. You become calm. Brief. Unreadable. No more emotional transparency. No more explaining your inner world. No more volunteering vulnerabilities to people who weaponize them. This is where the gray rock strategy becomes powerful. You become emotionally uninteresting to manipulate. Polite. Calm. Neutral. Like a wall with a heartbeat. And manipulators hate this because they survive on emotional reactions. They need your anger, your guilt, your need for validation, your emotional energy. Silence starves them. That's why when you emotionally detach, they often escalate. Suddenly they provoke more, push harder, create drama out of nowhere. Why? Because control is slipping. A healthy person notices your distance and asks, "Are you okay?" A manipulator notices your distance and asks, "How do I regain influence?" Huge difference. Machiavelli understood something cold about power. The man who remains emotionally disciplined controls the frame. That's why leaving quietly is often more powerful than exposing loudly. And one more thing. Stop trying to recruit mutual friends to your side. I know the temptation. You want people to understand what happened. You want witnesses, validation, proof you weren't crazy. But powerful men do not campaign for sympathy. They observe, detach, move on. Because over time, manipulators expose themselves naturally. Patterns always leak, masks always slip. And when that happens, people remember who stayed composed and who kept feeding chaos. That's real power, not revenge, not public exposure, not emotional warfare. Control. Cold, quiet control. And once you finally stop trying to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you, you become emotionally untouchable. Manipulation never enters your life looking dangerous. That's why so many men miss it. If manipulation looked evil from the beginning, nobody would fall for it. Nobody would stay. Nobody would slowly hand over their confidence, their clarity, their masculinity, piece by piece. No. Real manipulation arrives wearing the face of understanding, patience, charm, emotional intelligence, concern. It sounds mature, controlled, reasonable. That's what makes it lethal. Because by the time most men realize they're being manipulated, the damage is already psychological. They're no longer thinking clearly. They're negotiating against themselves internally every single day. And some of you watching this know exactly what I mean. You've felt yourself becoming smaller around certain people. More careful, more apologetic, more emotionally exhausted. You started over-explaining, monitoring your tone, rehearsing conversations in your head before they even happened. That's not peace. That's psychological survival mode. And the darkest part, most manipulators never technically force you to do anything. They simply create emotional conditions where betraying yourself feels easier than resisting them. That's how control really works. Slowly, quietly. Until one day you wake up and realize you haven't felt fully like yourself in months. I remember talking to a man who told me something that stayed in my head for a long time. He said, "I didn't even notice I was disappearing until I heard myself apologizing for things I didn't believe were wrong anymore." That's the moment manipulation wins. The moment you disconnect from your own instincts just to maintain emotional stability with someone else. And this is why awareness changes everything. Not because awareness magically removes manipulators from the world, but because once you see the pattern clearly, the illusion loses power. You stop reacting automatically. You stop chasing cold people. You stop defending yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stop negotiating with guilt. You stop explaining boundaries that should have been respected the first time. That shift right there changes a man completely. Because manipulators survive in emotional fog, confusion, guilt, urgency, self-doubt. That's their environment. And the moment clarity enters the room, their control starts collapsing. This is why calm men are so difficult to manipulate. Not loud men, not aggressive men. Calm men. Men who can sit in silence without panicking. Men who don't rush to explain themselves. Men who can tolerate being misunderstood without emotionally collapsing. That's real power. And understand this clearly. You do not need to expose every manipulator you meet. You do not need revenge. You do not need closure. You do not need them to finally admit what they did. You just need awareness. Because awareness changes your standards, your reactions, your tolerance. Once your mind becomes harder to manipulate, most toxic people remove themselves naturally because access to you no longer feels easy. That's why this video was never really about manipulation. It was about self-respect. The kind most men lose slowly without noticing. So here's what I want you to do after this video ends. Pick one thing. Just one. Maybe you stop over-explaining. Maybe you delay emotionally charged conversations until you're clear-headed. Maybe you stop chasing someone who intentionally went cold. Maybe you finally trust your instincts instead of asking everyone else what you should feel. Small actions, repeated consistently. That's how men rebuild psychological strength. And if this video exposed patterns you couldn't explain before, make sure you subscribe and share it with someone who's still trapped inside that confusion. Because the truth is, most people will spend their entire lives being psychologically controlled without ever realizing it. You won't. Now move differently. Stay calm. Stay sharp. And above all, stay unshaken.